she never learned what happened.
Yeah, that's not fishy at all. Died right before. That's the thing. Like, there's a lot of people who die right before they're going to say something when it involves this stuff, and you're not a tinfoil hat person to be like, you know, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, fucks like a duck. It's usually a duck. You know what I mean? Like, that's what's really frustrating. I understand that when you get embarrassed and some things are coming out of the hopper, like, that you don't want, you want to try to cover that up. But like, you're also just perpetuating that narrative over the years. Like, it's just kicking the can down the road when people disappear. Once in a while, yeah, I'm sure someone actually goes nuts and from what happened to him and does die. But like, every time you see one of these cases, oh, she just like, you know, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who's been fucking talking to everyone for the last 6 years, 7 years, longer than that. She just committed suicide. No worries. You know, we didn't get the Epstein files a few months ago, like they said. They keep saying they're going to put them out, and she just commits suicide. She got hit by a bus. Mm-hmm. Before that, you know, like just coincidentally a month before, that didn't finish the job. So now she killed herself.
In this particular
case,
it's
not true.
Well, in this particular case, I will say I don't think she was like assassinated or something like that, because when this victims task force was set up, they didn't know who these people were. They had to go to George White's diaries that had been donated to an electronics museum in California for some reason, and the guy who was in charge of it, Frank Lobinger, he had to find who these people were, hoping that maybe George White wrote their names down in these diaries. He ended up finding this one woman who was there with Clarice Stein when she was drugged, and through her, he learned that Clarice had died years before that. So, but the CIA didn't even know who she was.
Well,
before
I hate to play devil's advocate on it, but what was that guy's name?
Frank Lobinger. He's the guy who
Frank Lobinger have a wife? He have kids?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, if he did, that's not hard. Oh, you want to see your kid again? You want your kid to not get hit by a bus? What's that name you found right there? It's not easy. I mean, I don't have to be a spy to fucking figure that out. You know what I mean? Like, there are people, you said it a few minutes ago, and it's true. It's a human nature, who believe their intentions are so good that they will do things that they believe are with the right intentions that are straight up evil. Mm-hmm. And like falling on the shield because they feel like something like this is going to get exposed, and making sure that, you know, some lifeless hooker goes away. Of course they're going to do stuff like that. I'm not saying that's what happens every time. Sometimes someone really just does die. It's not like the internet where every goddamn thing is, you know, they're getting killed or whatever. But the idea that that doesn't happen sometimes, or the idea that like multiple of these people just happen to die right before they're going to go before some commission or testify, like, you can't look at that and say that's not at least very, very suspicious.
Yeah, and in fact, there's an instance in this book I talk about the church committee and people who were testifying before it, talking about some of these abuses of the past. And one of these people, I forget his name, but he was a mobster, and he had been somewhat involved in an assassination attempt on Fidel Castro, and he was going to be questioned like the day after he died, and he was shot in the back like 5 times and then turned over and shot in the head. And then the next day, William Colby, who is the former, you know, head of Central Intelligence, he said, and we had nothing to do with it.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. It's just
but
yeah.
While we're on the subject of George White, this guy, you know, at the beginning of the podcast, you mentioned kind of the link between these two books, Stanley Lovell and Sidney Gottlieb. One of the things I wanted to mention is that Sidney Gottlieb hires this guy, George White, to dose these people, you know, use these prostitutes in these safe houses to dose these people with LSD. How did Sidney Gottlieb know about George White? Because during World War II, Stanley Lovell, the head of this program in the OSS, he had hired George White to dose people with marijuana. That's the guy who was doing it. So it's like, oh, there's a connection between Sidney Gottlieb and Stanley Lovell right there. Sidney Gottlieb, in these depositions I found, I wanted to make this direct connection to Stanley Lovell. Like, how did they know each other? Was Sidney Gottlieb inspired or something? When I was in the Library of Congress where these depositions were, I found them and I was taking pictures of them real quick. So I couldn't read through them because I only have a limited time in the archives. So I didn't, you know, I wanted to take these pictures. As I'm turning through them, I see the name Stanley Lovell and I think, oh my gosh, there's his name. But I couldn't stop and read it, you know. So later I go into the depositions when I actually have some time, and it turns out this attorney, Joseph Rao, asked Sidney Gottlieb, who's Stanley Lovell? Do you know about this guy? And he says, oh, yes, when I was getting started with MKUltra, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about mind control. And I was tasked with this program and I didn't know what to do. So how did I kind of learn what to do? I went into the files of the OSS and I looked at some of the experiments they were doing. So it's like, oh, there's my connection right there. He says it in the depositions. So that was a good connection. And then he goes and hires George White, who Stanley Lovell was using to do these drug experiments in World War II.
When you find that, you got to be like, oh my God.
Yeah, I was super excited. When I saw the name on the deposition, I knew, there's something to this. Yeah, great.
Whoa. All right, so back at the beginning with MKUltra, when they start, we went on an amazing tangent here. So
what is MKUltra?
Yeah. So you had already said it was based on them trying to figure out how Korean prisoners of war maybe were turned and told some truce on things. But Gottlieb is involved from day one. You've mentioned some of the other people who are involved. You've mentioned that it's compartmentalized. But what do we know, like the exact year when they first started and what that looked like when they did? Yeah,
1953. Yeah, there were actually some precursor projects before that. One was called Bluebird because the goal was to develop a truth drug using, whatever, either sodium amytal or some kind of other drug. And it was called Bluebird because they wanted to make these prisoners sing like a bird. So there was another one a little bit after that called Artichoke. The Bluebird kind of got morphed into Artichoke. And that was similar, trying to develop truth drugs and interrogation methods. And then pretty shortly after that, it's not like Artichoke morphed into that. Artichoke kind of died out. And then in 1953, Alan Dulles signed, MKUltra into being. So that's when it started. In fact, right before Alan Dulles creates MKUltra, Richard Helms recommends that he does this. Richard Helms is kind of spearheading this. He eventually becomes director of the CIA. Right before Alan Dulles signs this paper kind of establishing MKUltra, he gives a speech at an alumni conference at Princeton University, just to a group of alumni, which is crazy to me. And it's on brainwashing. And he talks about how the Soviets, they have all these techniques and we need to develop a program ourselves to be able to understand what they're doing and, all this stuff. And it's like, I couldn't believe that you actually are saying this just in a speech to some alumni. And so right after that, like 3 days later, he creates MKUltra. So it wasn't exactly completely secret, what his interest was. But that's when it starts. And shortly afterwards, Sidney Gottlieb was put in charge of it. And then he kind of runs it from there, establishing ultimately 149 subprojects. So
149.
MKUltra is the umbrella program, the name of it. And it's composed of 149 subprojects. George White's Operation Midnight Climax, that's one. Ewan Cameron and doing all that stuff in Montreal, the psychic driving and electric shock therapy, that's another one. Now, it's not that there was 149 total. I mean, there were 149, but many of those are kind of duplicates. Like if you're going to renew a subproject, it might get a new subproject number. So it's not as much as it kind of seems, but there are a lot of these.
Whoa. So they don't all develop day one though, right?
No, they develop over like a decades-long period. Yeah.
Okay. What's Sidney Gottlieb's story? Like, how did he even end up there? Long before this happens, like, who was he? Where did he come from? What made him tick? You know, obviously, you spent a lot of time basically being a biographer of him in a way to write this book. So, what was he all about?
Yeah, he is a chemist from Brooklyn, or from the Bronx, I think, and he was a brilliant chemist. He had gone to several different universities. The University of Wisconsin was one of them. And then he got his PhD in bioorganic chemistry from Caltech. So he was very bright. He got his PhD right during World War II. And he wanted to volunteer to go fight in World War II, but he had a club foot. And so he was denied the ability to do that because of his physical ailment. So he couldn't fight in World War II, and he always kind of felt not a resentment for that, but he felt like he owed a debt to his country to, I need to make up for this thing that I wasn't able to do. His parents were immigrants from Hungary, Jewish immigrants from Hungary, and he felt that he owed a debt to this country to, pay something back for the life that he was able to get because his parents were able to come here. So he owed this debt to his country in a way. He always felt like an outsider, it seemed to me. The first chapter of this book is called The Outsider, kind of his backstory. He was born with a stutter and this club foot, so he was always kind of picked on, made fun of. He didn't really fit in, and he was Jewish going into the CIA. The kind of joke about the CIA is it's like Yale, male, and pale. Right. So
Skull and Bones.
So that's kind of who he was. He was this chemist looking to make a name for himself, and Alan Dulles took a liking to him pretty early on. I think Dulles was born with a clubfoot too, so I think they bonded over that a little bit. And then Dulles put him in charge of MKUltra. He was this brilliant chemist. Before he was put in charge, he worked in the chemical branch of the TSS, the Technical Services Staff, and he was in charge of helping to do things like secret writing. What are different inks that we can develop to make them disappear on the page, stuff like that. And then he got put in on this.
Okay, so do you think he had? You mentioned he was a little different, a little bullied and stuff growing up. Do you think there was an aspect of the, I don't know, almost like mad scientist experimentation he was doing across all these different projects that was based on him feeling a sense of power?
I hesitate to say that. One of the reasons why is because the structure of MKUltra isn't what many people think that it is. So it's not as if Gottlieb is doing these experiments. For the most part, he's funding people who are already doing these experiments. This is what sometimes people don't realize about MKUltra. It's not George White in Operation Midnight Climax being the main exception. What mostly is happening with these subprojects is that there are researchers at universities and prisons and hospitals that are already doing these experiments, and they're already publishing about them. Even though it's kind of crazy to think about, you're dosing these people with drugs, sometimes they aren't really giving informed consent, and you're publishing about this, but that's what they were doing. And Sidney Gottlieb sees this, and so he decides to fund them so they continue doing that so he can learn whether it leads to anything. So that's kind of the structure. It's not that MKUltra initiates all of these experiments. In many cases, it's just trying to make sure that these experiments continue happening. So
right, but if you're doing things like some of those 149 projects where there's a power dynamic to it. Midnight Climax is just the best example. Mm-hmm. You would think that the person who's running that, I'm not saying it means it, but you might be suspicious that there's a level of pleasure they get from that. Like basically almost like I'm here in the ivory tower and all these types of people who would have made fun of me, they're just the regular plebs of society and we'll do what we want to try to show them how the big boys run society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that might be a part of it. And also I wouldn't discount what you mentioned there, kind of the pleasure of it. In many instances, not necessarily the sub-projects that he's not doing himself, but in many instances, it does seem like he is trying to be one of the boys. Right. He's trying to, let's do this funny prank on this guy because it'll be fun at the office. For example, let's put some LSD into the punch bowl at the holiday party and see what happens. And then a guy drinks it and he ends up like going insane for that night and running around and they can't find him and he almost gets hit by a car. So that's the kind of thing.
Wait, that wasn't Wormwood guy, was it?
No, that wasn't Frank Olsen. Right. Yeah, this is a different thing, but it's similar to that kind of story. But yeah, it is kind of Sidney Gottlieb's story. I do think he's trying to fit in a lot of ways. And if, hey, they're joking around with each other, here's a practical joke I can do. I can place LSD within some of this stuff. And, at the same time, I can see how they react to it. So I can learn something about it and I can justify this by saying, I'm just for national security. But really, I'm trying to be one of the boys.
Did you, we were talking about that off camera. You saw that Wormwood documentary on Netflix several years ago, right? So what was that guy's name? Frank
Olsen.
Frank Olsen. Mm-hmm. And what was the story there again for people who haven't seen that?
Yes, he was a bacteriologist in what's called Fort Detrick. That's the country's biological warfare installation. So he was in charge of kind of developing biological weapons that could be dropped, if need be, whether they be anthrax bombs or something else. So his specialty was the airborne distribution of pathogens. So he was involved in several experiments like that. He and a group within the Fort Detrick called the Special Operations Division, a group of scientists mostly who were involved in that kind of stuff, they occasionally met with the people who were involved in MKUltra from the CIA. So they would meet at this retreat called Deep Creek, and they would exchange information. They often cooperated with each other. If the CIA needed some kind of biological something, they would get it from Fort Detrick. And if they needed information about how someone reacted to whatever, they would get it from the CIA. So they would share information about their experiments. And at one of these experiments at Deep Creek, Sidney Gottlieb and his underling, Robert Lashbrook, another chemist, they decided we're going to dose everyone with LSD and you're going to see what happens. So they put some LSD into the liquor and they started pouring, bottles for everyone or shots for everyone, except for a couple people. One guy had a heart problem, so they didn't give it to him. And another one was a reformed alcoholic, and they thought, well, we're not going to give him any either. So a few people were spared, but Frank Olsen is one of the people who got the LSD that night. And, in this book, I have during the depositions, Gottlieb and Lashbrook are questioned in depth about, how it all went down, how they poured it and all this stuff. So if anyone's interested, there's a lot more detail that they give to how that night went down. But Frank Olsen gets this LSD, and most of the people who are there, the room starts spinning, they start seeing hallucinations, they start laughing uncontrollably, and then they go to sleep. But he can't. He seems to have some kind of psychotic break. He leaves this retreat, he goes back home to his wife, Alice, and she knows that something is off with him. Something doesn't seem right. She's asking him, what's wrong? What's wrong? And all he says is, I made a terrible mistake. Something went wrong. I ruined the experiment. And he won't elaborate on what that is. And so she's really concerned about him. The next day he goes to work, and his boss, this guy named Vincent Ruitt, who is at that retreat, he tells his boss, I think you should fire me. I don't deserve this job. I ruined the experiment, something. And his boss is saying, what are you talking about? Like, you haven't done anything wrong. And the next day he says the same thing. He comes back to his boss's office. No, I think you should fire me. Something's wrong. So he seems to be having some kind of mental instability, or something's happening precipitated by this LSD being put in his drink. So Ruitt is worried about him. So is Lashbrook and Gottlieb. They decide they're going to send him to a guy named Harold Abramson in New York, who is kind of a CIA affiliate, so he knows that these LSD experiments go on, but he's also, I think he's actually like an allergist, but they say he's a psychologist or something. Maybe he can help him in some way. So they send they send Olsen to Abramson, and they start talking for a while. It turns out they had known each other from World War II. They had worked on a couple projects and knew each other from that. And then Lashbrook accompanies him up there. Once Lashbrook leaves the room, Olsen says, I think they're trying to put stuff in my food and drink. I've got this paranoid. He's paranoid.
He's breaking.
He's breaking, exactly. Yeah, so the next day is Thanksgiving. So they decide, well, we're going to take Olsen back to Maryland, where he's from, to spend Thanksgiving with his family. So they fly back to Maryland. Once they get there, they haven't even gotten home yet, but he gets off the plane and he says, something's wrong. I think, the police are out to get me. Just send me to the police station. They're looking for me anyway. It's like, what are you talking about? Nobody's looking for you. So they decide, well, he's really not in the state to go be with his family right now. So one of the people who were accompanying him, they go tell Alice that we're going to take him back to New York. They end up taking him back to New York after that to meet with Abramson again. And Abramson decides, we need to commit you to like a psychiatric hospital because, something's wrong. He agrees to it, but the psychiatric hospital doesn't have any spare beds. And so they need to wait an extra day before they can go down to it. Okay, so they spend the next day in New York. They're kind of wasting time. And then that night they go to the Statler Hotel in New York. Him and Robert Lashbrook, they're going to, stay in the room together. And at 2:30 in the morning, he jumps out the window and he dies. He falls 10 floors to the 7th Avenue sidewalk and he dies. So that's the story of Frank Olsen. There are a lot of potential explanations of what was going on. Frank Olsen's son, Eric Olsen, thinks that his father was murdered.
Yes.
He thinks that this was like a planned thing. The CIA wanted to kill his father, potentially because his father had moral qualms about what they were doing. Maybe they were kind of releasing biological agents somewhere, had harmed some people. Maybe they really had released biological agents on Korea during the Korean War, and he was having these pangs of conscience, and maybe he was going to go public about it or something like that, and so they offed him. So that's what Eric Olsen thinks. I'm kind of skeptical of that. In fact, I am skeptical of that. I don't think that's what happened. I think Frank Olsen did have some kind of psychotic break, and I do think he jumped out the window.
Could you see why they think he was killed, though?
Oh, yeah.
Because he had access before any break like this. He had access to some of the...
Yeah, there's certainly motive. There's certainly motive there. Yeah, it's just a question of, did anyone act on that motive? I don't think they did. One of the explanations that people will often give about how another supposed piece of proof that the CIA was involved in this and they killed Frank Olsen is that in 1953, the year that this happened, there is a primer on assassinations that is created by the CIA talking about what are the best ways to kill someone. And one of the best ways, it says, is to push them out from a tall place so they can fall.
And then he gets out
and
a window.
that's what happened. Yeah. So that's one of the links people will use. Oh, well, obviously they knew this was a method of assassination that could potentially not lead to anyone being found out about it. So obviously this must have been what happened to him.
It doesn't mean guilt. That's a hell of a coincidence.
It doesn't mean guilt.
But actually, in their defense on this one, that's not exactly a generational idea right there. I feel like that's been done throughout human history. People fall. They can't fly.
For me too, one of the things is they didn't know that Frank Olsen was going to want to go back to New York when they took him to Maryland. So they're going to have to set all this up, and then one day that he decides, no, actually, I want to go back to New York, and
or he didn't.
Yeah, or
he didn't,
that could be the case.
And they say, yeah, he wanted to go back. What do you know?
Yeah.
Oh, then he died.
That could be the case. Yeah.
Yeah. We tried to bring him back to Maryland. He didn't want to do it.
Yeah. Well, I'm skeptical of that. But another thing too with Frank Olsen, maybe it not something that makes me think that it wasn't an assassination, a murder, is that a lot of the other people who were surreptitiously dosed with LSD under these same projects reacted in the same way as Frank Olsen did. So I mentioned that woman, Clarice Stein. She had the exact same kind of psychotic break. There are a few other people. I don't.
But was she threatening? And I don't know if he was either. I can't remember the case. Was that woman, Clarice, saying anything like what we're doing is wrong and people need to find out about this or something like that? Because I think, if I remember, it's been a while. I think that was the implication he was saying. Frank was saying stuff like that to people behind the scenes, like what we're doing is wrong. So they're worried, like you said, that he might say something. But the other people, maybe they weren't saying that. Maybe
she was not, because she didn't know about any of this. She was just some random woman who happened to be at the wrong party and got dosed with this stuff.
So that would be different.
But see, what I think of is, well, I don't even know if Frank Olsen was actually saying that, So his son says that, he was having these pangs of conscience, but was he? I don't know if he was. Like, I don't think he was.
Was his son again when he died?
He was maybe 9 years old, something like that. He was very young. Yeah.
So he wouldn't have like heavy conversations with his dad at that time.
No. At least, I'm assuming not about his work.
Yeah, not something he would understand or be able to process for sure. Yeah, that's interesting because also like Cy Hirsch, who's at the middle of that story, he tracked that for decades. But Cy is one of those guys. He builds some cases that are amazing and works on them for years and multi-source to the gills and everything, and it's like, oh, maybe there might be something here. And then there's other cases where he'll write 5,000-6,000 words on one source, anonymous, and it's not to say it's wrong, it's just like every time he's reporting on something, it's something insane. It's like, are all these true? Probably not, but some of them are, and it's kind of your best guess. But in his defense, like that's whenever you're reporting on these types of places, these agencies, that is how it is. You're going to get somewhere. It's like this might actually be happening, and others like, yeah, maybe there's another explanation here.
And there's so many, I mentioned there are 149 subprojects. I have one chapter that's called Subprojects where I try to briefly explain some of the ones that I can't go into a lot of detail because I can't have a chapter on every single one.
That's why you're on the podcast. Let's go into some detail.
I wanted to bring up one of the more absurd ones, sad ones. It involves animal experimentation, but they were planning on putting... Oh, they're not planning. They did put electrodes into the brains of animals and stimulating in them in such a way that they can control their movements. So this was done with dogs and rats and several other kinds of animals. But this is Subproject 94. But you would implant this electrode and you would stimulate the pleasure center of the brain, is what it says in the kind of description of the subproject. And you actually, it worked. You actually could get a dog to walk in the pre-desired direction. So if there was, the researcher who's responsible for this would go to a grass field and kind of plot out in his mind an invisible path that the dog doesn't know, but okay, I want him to do a loop here and then go this way. And so, if the dog goes in the correct direction, the desired direction, you would stimulate that part of the brain, the pleasure center, as positive feedback. And so it would continue. If the dog moves in a different direction, you would stop the stimulation. And so the dog would continuously search for where the stimulation is. Once it finds it, it would then hone in on the correct path and go forward. So by doing this repeatedly, you could get it to walk in a pre-desired path. You could do this with rats too. It was done. And some of the crazier documents that I found about MKUltra involves this subproject where they're trying to explain what are they trying to do here? So in these documents, they mention that ultimately we want to use this for, and this is their quote, executive action type operations, which is obviously like assassination attempts. Right. And they say we want to try to put biological and chemical weapons on these animals and then steer them in the desired direction to get close to a target, and then that's going to kill them in some way. What animals are wanting to be used? They said bears and yaks are the most desirable animals because they can carry really heavy payloads. So if we can get a bear, I'm guessing
a bear close to to a president?
Well, I have no clue. This is the thing. Not that this was actually done, but in the documents, they're kind of speculating on what our desired thing is. And at the end of the documents, it says our ultimate goal is to apply this to humans. Basically, we want to see if we could do this. Not that they ever did, but that was kind of the ultimate goal. This is like the real life Manchurian Candidate. Can we stimulate someone's brain in order to make them move in a desired direction, like a marionette? Yeah, so that was one of the crazier sub-projects.
The idea, though, at the beginning of MKUltra, like you said, was they had a suspicion that Koreans were controlling minds or something in the war when they were torturing prisoners. And as you put in, everyone said this, like that turned out not to be true. Mm-hmm. That said, is it possible that maybe there's some things they figured out in MKUltra that we don't know about, that like this is a bit of a facade to put up, like, yeah, we tried this thing, it was fucked up, we had to admit about it, and yeah, it's ancient history now. But, there's another section called MKUltra++, where, they actually did figure out how to fucking control the mind and have been doing stuff like that.
Yeah, there are a couple things to say about that. Mind control is possible, but not in the way that MKUltra thought it would be. So I'll touch on that in a second, because at the very end of the book, I say, Sidney Gottlieb may not have developed methods of mind control, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. And here's kind of how they do. So I'll return to that in a second.
I was concerned, by the way, when you were saying animals, that you were going to say pigeons.
Oh, pigeon? Is that like your favorite animal or something?
The conspiracy theory, pigeons are just drones. So I'm like, and they walk right up next to you, Yeah. I'm a big pigeon defender, by the way, so I don't think that, but my buddy Mark Gagnon.
The birds aren't real kind of dynamic.
Yeah. He's always like, they're not real, and the pigeons are very dumb. And I'm like, no, they're actually very smart, so you never know. But please continue on what you were saying.
I don't think it's the case that MKUltra found methods of mind control in the sense that you could make someone do something you wanted them to do actively. Like if we wanted to make someone assassinate someone else, they didn't find ways to make someone do that like against their will or something. What they did do is find ways to discredit someone or make them go insane or seeming like they went insane by slipping them LSD. One of the plots that Sidney Gottlieb is involved in, besides all the assassination plots on Fidel Castro, there's one plot to, why don't we gift him cigars that have been laced with LSD right before he's going to give a big speech or something? So he's going to, suck on these cigars. He's going to get hit with this stuff. He's going to go on an acid trip, and he's going to start spewing all this nonsense, and people are going to lose their faith in him because this guy's crazy. Like, how can we trust him? He's going insane. So you can make someone appear insane like that. You can manipulate them in that way, but not in a controlled way to make them do something, at least not with the methods that Sidney Gottlieb is involved in, especially drugs and hypnosis. That being said, there were some useful things, like active positive things, not positive in the sense that good, positive in the sense that you could actively do it, that came from MKUltra. One of them had to do with a sub-project that's conducted by this psychologist named Martin Orne, and it involved interrogations. How do we get someone to reveal the truth in an interrogation? The goal of MKUltra was to develop a truth drug, but it turns out there's not really a truth drug that all of a sudden you're going to take it and now I'm going to spill all my secrets. Right. You can lower someone's inhibitions, and you can, people have known for thousands of years, you can do that with wine, just some alcohol, and you're going to lower your inhibitions and they might say something they otherwise might not have. However, there's no targeted truth drug, but Martin Orne realizes that either with a truth drug or with hypnosis, you don't necessarily have to do it for it to be effective. So you don't actually have to put someone in a hypnotized state to make them hypnotized in order for hypnosis to be effective. So this is kind of an ironic thing, but he says, if you can make them think that they've been hypnotized or make them think that they've taken a truth drug, then that might lower their inhibitions by thinking, well, they've given this thing to me and basically, I have no choice in the matter because it's going to work anyway, so I might as well just spill my secrets. So if you can induce the belief that they're hypnotized or that the belief that this truth drug is effective, even if it's not, that might be effective in itself because you lower their inhibitions and make them think, I might as well just say I have no choice. They gave me this truth drug. What am I going to do?
That's next level mind fuckery right there.
There's a report, I think it gets released, I think it's created maybe in 1963 called KUBARK, Counterintelligence Interrogation. And KUBARK is the CIA's cryptonym for itself. So, like MKUltra is a cryptonym. The CIA's cryptonym for itself was KUBARK for a long time. And so this is on KUBARK. KUBARK. So if you wanted to refer to the CIA, but not the CIA, it would be KUBARK. Or at least was. It's not anymore.
God, what a terrible name.
I don't know where that derives from. But this manual gets released in 1963, and they're talking about interrogation methods. And this is one of the things they point to. They say torture it talks about torture a little bit, but it says in large part it's not that effective because if you resort to torture early in an interrogation, then the interrogatee is going to realize that you have no other options left, you know. And so if they can just hold out for a little while longer, then you're probably going to stop, and they're probably right, you know. So it says that's not useful. If you resort to torture at the very end of an interrogation after doing everything else, then they're going to realize that you're at your last resort, and so they're going to know, oh, if I can just hold on a little bit longer, then they're done with whatever they can do.
What was it? KSM used to like count the seconds while he was getting waterboarded as to when they had to stop.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah,
keep going.
So this KUBARK report, it references this work of Martin Orne saying, you know, this is the potential for a proper interrogation method that might actually work better than torture, at least induce the state of, if not hypnosis, the belief that the state of hypnosis has been induced. So that's where some of this was actually turned into a useful thing that got acknowledged by the CIA and put in this report about interrogation methods.
All right, real fast. I gotta go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
You're blowing my mind, though. This is crazy. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. That is interesting, by the way, when you were saying back in there that there's like documentation of the torture not necessarily working because people are just going to say what you want and stuff. And that is decades before they actually try the enhanced interrogation program. So it's interesting just either the cognitive dissonance or whatever that is to then be like, no, but it'll work this time.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I try to make that at the end of this book too, because these MKUltra methods, they try to make them work through drugs or hypnosis or whatever, and it's kind of a failure. You know, they aren't really able to make someone spill the beans in an interrogation or whatever. However, during, you know, the war on terror, you have these enhanced interrogations, these torture. The reason why the CIA was trying to develop these MKUltra methods is because it was trying to get away from that. What are methods that actually work? So it's so ironic that we eventually end up going back to, you know, torture. Isn't that why we were trying to develop these alternative methods? Because the original ones didn't work, and now we're going to return back to those because, well, if MKUltra doesn't work, I guess we'll just stick with what we've done before.
Mind control's better. It's better. It's nice. You can clean that one up a little bit and say, well, we're not torturing them. We're just getting the truth, you know?
Yeah.
It's an easier sale.
Yeah. And, you know, with the phrase even enhanced interrogation at the beginning of this book, I mentioned several of these euphemisms within the intelligence community. I even go down a long list of different presidential administrations. Instead of saying assassination, well, we don't say assassination. It's, you know, targeted killing, or it's lethal direct action, or it's, you know, liquidation or something like that. It's, you know, so the intelligence community is filled with these kinds of euphemisms, which is kind of Orwellian, you know. And I think it's Politics in the English Language. George Orwell writes about euphemisms within the state and how it, you know, we call it pacification, but what is it really? Like when you look at it, it's, you know, killing these innocent children and whatever. Okay, yeah, but we'll call it pacification. Like it's pacifying, you know, we're just calming things down. But yeah, so that's pretty rife within the intelligence community.
Well, yeah, and it's rife everywhere. It's window dressing. I mean, I've heard Edward Snowden talk about like the prime example of the Patriot Act. You pass something called the Patriot Act right after 9/11. It's like got the name Patriot in it. Like it sounds fucking amazing. It might as well be called Save the Puppies Act. No one's going to vote against it just on the title. But if you read the fine print, you're like, wait a minute. This says, hold on a second. The Constitution's not going to exist after this. And that's the, you know, why would it be any different in the spy world? Because they do have to look out for when certain programs may actually come public or something like that. It's interesting though, because you know, there was like a lot of hoopla with the whole JFK thing getting released. I mean, I appreciate that. We got something, right? Like, no one's ever done that before. But
as a historian, the more documents, let's see them.
Have you poured through them at all?
No.
So I guess it's like 80,000 documents or something. I haven't personally poured through them. I've talked to some people who've gone through a lot of them. But it's like, you know, they're not... Andy Bustamante, who's an ex-CIA spy, I always put that in air quotes, you know, he talks about how... And I think he's right, unfortunately. He's like, if there were ever even documents created about this that could point anything back anywhere near the CIA or Pentagon, I can assure you if they were even created, they were destroyed shortly thereafter or immediately. And you have to wonder, you know, if you're able to go through, to bring this back to MKUltra, if you're able to go through and find some depositions where like Sidney Gottlieb, like the godfather of this, is actually talking, that's amazing because we at least have something. If we were able to get some admission of that through the church commission and things like that, like that's amazing. That's something. But you do wonder about all the things that we're never going to know about that they did. Like you say 149 subprograms, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe there was a zero behind that and we don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's got to be stressful to think about when you're researching this, because it's like, man, I got such a big picture here, but am I just looking at the dot on the page and there's actually a whole galaxy out there we're missing? You ever think about that?
I do, but I think that is kind of a slippery slope because you can always say, well, it could have been this or it could have been that. It could have been anything, but I'm not, as a historian, I don't do could haves. I do what was the case. What can I show you was the case? And what are the documents that lead me to say this? Anything could be true, but I have to determine what was as far as I can prove.
Yeah.
So this is especially rife within some of these conspiracy theorists that I talk about in the very last chapter of this book, where they especially point to the fact that since Gottlieb destroyed these MKUltra files, thousands of them, that kind of opens the door for them to paint MKUltra as anything they want to of their wildest imagination.
Yes.
Maybe it was involving sex slaves, and maybe they did actually have vice presidents hunting people for sport inside of military enclosures, and maybe it really does control pop star Britney Spears or this other thing. So, the conspiracy theorists especially will latch on to the idea that we can't know everything about MKUltra, therefore it could have been this too.
Everything.
Yeah. The problem they run into, though, from my perspective, is that they don't have anything to prove what they're saying, so it's not verifiable. And then when you point out that they don't have anything, they'll say, well, of course we don't, like it was destroyed. Of course we don't, like the CIA is not going to release that stuff. So it's lacking proof. It can't be proven, but it also can't be disproven.
Right.
So it's like it's not falsifiable, but it's also not verifiable. It's like it's a win-win for them either way. And any kind of theory that's way that you can never be wrong, I'm kind of skeptical of that.
No, that's a great point. And you know what's interesting? You're kind of like in the middle here, like you're a middleman in a way, not intentionally, but it's a useful place to be because you're reporting on something that actually did exist. We know that was bad. And you're also finding new information that was available out there in the public domain to kind of put the story together more so you can point to this is where, lack of oversight and compartmentalization goes wrong. But you're also trying to just, like a lawyer, stay with the facts. What do we know? It doesn't mean all these other things aren't true. But if you make a leap on the 5% and then say, no, that means it's 100%. Well, you've just made a 95% leap without evidence. And that, even if you want to rip the CIA on stuff, which we all do, like in a court of law, at least, like you can't do that if you're making a real case. So I can understand that. And like some people get pissed off by that because they want to believe every fucking thing ever is a conspiracy. And yes, like I said earlier, there are some stuff where it's like, okay, all these people died right before they were going to testify, stuff like that. There's certainly something there. But it gets tough because, the tracks get covered, documents get destroyed, and, we kind of have to operate like we don't know what we don't know and live in that state of suspicion.
And once we learn enough about MKUltra, we find these documents and depositions and, all kinds of other records, I feel like we can know enough about it to know what it wasn't. So we can't know everything about what it was, but we can know about what it wasn't. And here's an analogy that's helpful for me to think of to make that make sense a little bit more. If I'm to ask someone, what's the shape of the earth? They'll hopefully say a sphere, something like it's spherical, but that's not quite right. It's not really a sphere. It spins. And so it bulges on it bulges, so it's an oblate spheroid, it's thicker in the middle than it is at the top and bottom. So it's an oblate sphere, but that's not quite right either because it has this complicated topography. There are mountains and valleys and all that. We can't ever know the exact shape of the earth, but we can have a really good approximation of what it is. A sphere is a really good approximation. We can know enough about the shape of the earth to know it's not flat. So we can't know exactly what it is, but we can know enough about it to know it's not that. The same with MKUltra. We can't know everything that happened under MKUltra, but we can know enough about it to know that it doesn't involve presidents using jelly beans to control these people into sex slaves or whatever, which is what one of these people claims. So, that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
It's tough, though, too, because we're living in a time where people have access to so much and then start to, like we were saying earlier in a similar conversation, start to get ideas in their head that they're married to. You cannot convince them otherwise. You see this again and again. And it's, I always give the example of like, imagine, let's assume for a second that wall back there actually were pure white. Someone out there would be like, well, it's technically whatever. Just assume it was actually pure white for a second. You could bring back, with certain people, you could bring back the fucking ghost of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo for the scientific and artistic perspective of why this wall is white. They could give a dissertation on it for 25 minutes, and some guy will nod along and at the end of that be like, fuck that, it's black. It's just how it is. You're not going to convince everyone. So that's just, I especially in the type of seat I am where we talk with different people about ideas and whatever, there's always, you're never going to make everyone happy. There's going to be people who are like, that guy was full of shit. And there's going to be people who are be like, there's nothing that guy said that was wrong. And, I think that's just, in the free speech environment, that's kind of what we got to operate in.
And one thing to keep in mind too is it's not like I think these people aren't smart or something like that. I think they're very rational in a way, because if you start from a false premise, if we start from the premise that this wall is black, we can rationalize different ways to make that real for us. If you start from a false premise, humans are really good at rationalizing things. So we can rationalize the world to start with the premise that even if it's false, we can, if we believe it, we can make everything make sense of that false premise. The trick is to start with true premises. What are the premises we can start with and derive other things from and know that's true? But if you start from a false premise, being rational sometimes is a bad thing in that case, because you can rationalize anything. Because we're so good at reasoning, I can think of a reason for, of course, that wall isn't white, it's black. There must be some chemical in the air that's making me see white because you're trying to trick me into thinking that I can rationalize anyway. So at the end of the book, I try to explain a way to hopefully get around this. And it's by asking a few questions, and the most important of which is, what's more probable? You always have to go with the probability. So for any given set of evidence, there is always going to be a potential infinite amount of explanations or interpretations of that evidence. The example I sometimes give is, if my keys are on my nightstand when I go to sleep and I wake up and they're not there, then that's the evidence. But what's the interpretation of that evidence? One interpretation is that aliens beamed it up into their spaceship and it's gone. Another is that someone broke into my house and stole it and were very quiet and I didn't hear them or wake up. Another is that my wife took them and is off, in my car doing something. So how do I determine between those explanations? I can't appeal to the evidence itself because they all account for that same evidence. I can't say, well, my keys are gone. Obviously, my wife took them. No, but the alien thing accounts for why my keys are gone too. I have to appeal to what's more probable between those. Well, I have examples of my wife doing that in the past. She's taken my keys off my nightstand, whatever. I don't have any examples of the aliens. It could be that. It doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means it's a less probable one. So you got to go with the probability.
Yeah, it's fair. I don't disagree with that. But one of the things in the middle of MKUltra that gets discussed a lot that I think you went into in your book, I got to find out when I read it, but we were at least talking off air a little bit about it, was the whole hippie movement and like the time that this was going on, because you had like the Great Awakening happening in the 60s, the countercultural movement, rock music, peace, love, and drugs, like the whole bit. And a lot of the, let's say, the vibe or politics of the hippies and the people there were more along the lines of, say, Marxist, which is not a perfect way of putting it, but at least like if you were from the traditional U.S. standpoint, that's how they looked at these people. And, Tom O'Neill wrote this pretty unbelievable book that was 20 years in the making when he put it out, called Chaos. And people have heard that Rogan podcast. He's been on Danny Jones and other shows as well since then. But, essentially, he started with this investigation that was supposed to be, I think he was going to work on it for 3 months. It was supposed to be a piece just commemorating the 30-year murder for Esquire magazine or something, the 30-year anniversary of the Manson murders. And it turned into this whole thing where he basically was like destitute for a while even, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and became this book, and he probably has another book in him. But part of what he seemed to get at, and there were a lot of different pieces to this, was that Manson was maybe linked to MKUltra, and that the CIA and government organizations wanted to basically infiltrate the peace and love hippie movement because they were concerned about the political ramifications of something like that getting out of control. Did you look at any of this in your investigation related to MKUltra?
Yeah, I have a chapter on Jolly West, who was in charge of one of the subprojects, and he's the main guy that Tom O'Neill says was involved in either doing some kind of experiments with Manson or on Manson or something like that. So I have a chapter on Jolly West. I didn't look really into Manson myself because he already has that book, and that's not really the thrust of my book. I only have one chapter to do this, and so that didn't become a big part of mine.
Can you tell everyone about Jolly West who's not familiar?
Yes, Jolly West is this. He's this psychiatrist who was working at Lackland Air Force Base. He was the guy, I think I mentioned at the beginning of this, that was interviewing these servicemen who were prisoners of war in Korea and trying to determine whether they were being mind controlled or something else. Tom O'Neill makes the connection that Jolly Weston later in his career went to UCLA and he was doing some experiments over there. Jolly West had this connection with Sidney Gottlieb. They have this correspondence that's in Jolly West's paper at UCLA. Gottlieb goes under a pseudonym in the correspondence, Sherman Grifford, but it's Sidney Gottlieb. And West says that I would love to do some experiments, and MKUltra starts funding him to do some of these. A lot of it's like hypnotism experiments, trying to implant false memories, something like that. And O'Neill tries to make this connection between West and Manson. They were kind of at similar locations at about the same time. I like his book for a couple of reasons, and I don't like it for one reason.
Okay.
But the writing is phenomenal. And here, the best part about the book, to me, content aside, I love gonzo journalism where it's the person there doing the thing. I'm reading his story of how he came to find out about this. I love the behind the scenes. Yes. Let's get into the archives. Let's tell me about the interviews, how they went, how you found this person. He does such a good job of that, telling his own story of finding out about this. So that was my favorite part of the book. The second part of the book is it's kind of 3 different books. That's one book. The next part is about Manson, like the Manson murders. And there was a previous book about the Manson murders, Helter, Skelter, by this guy Bugliosi. And Tom O'Neill
writes about a lot.
Yeah, he kind of takes that apart, saying, Bugliosi is saying that Manson did this because he wanted to spark a race war and all this stuff, but O'Neill kind of picks that apart and says that's not what's happening here.
Bugliosi was crazy, man. He was a demented guy.
Yeah, and the third part of the book is O'Neill making this or trying to make this connection between Jolly West and Manson. Maybe Manson was involved in this some way. Maybe he was a victim of one of these experiments. Maybe that led him to do certain things or manipulate certain people. Maybe he learned how to do something from this. I don't really see that. O'Neill himself admits in the book that he never really found the smoking gun evidence that these two people ever interacted or around each other. They're kind of in the same place. It's possible that they did. But again, for me, possible, something about that word just doesn't sit right. In history, I always try to stay away from words like maybe, probably, might be, could be, should be, possibly. Those are unsure words, and I want to be sure of what I'm saying. There was a documentary made based on chaos. I think it's called Chaos on Netflix. And again, in that documentary, O'Neill says, yeah, I think there's a connection somewhere in there, but I wasn't really able to make it. And to me, it's like, okay, it's a good book. I like learning about all 3 of these things, but I just don't see how they coalesce together that well. Like, what's the connection?
if there's not specifically, as Tom O'Neill seems to admit as well, a smoking gun that, say, Jolly West was in the same room with Charles Manson or something like that, wasn't the case, though, that he makes of I forget the guy's name, but the probation officer for Manson just repeatedly, with no explanation, letting him off and also having direct connections to CIA. And then even go back to Manson's times in juvenile where, he was in trouble and living in juvie hall, and there's evidence to say he was experimenting on. Wouldn't that alone, without the Jolly West smoking gun scenario, point to a strong possibility that a hippie like Manson, who had a lot of pre-existing problems, was someone who clearly could have been targeted for a program like this, similarly to how they targeted, people with hookers in rooms behind, double-sided glass?
Yeah, it's possible, but it gets, again, to that question of what's more probable. So on that documentary, I don't know if this was in the book, but it's in the documentary, which I think it was a good inclusion. They interview one of the cult members. He was convicted of murder. It wasn't like Sharon Tate. It wasn't those murders. Right. It was a drug deal gone bad, I think it was. And Bobby Beausoleil, I think was his name. And they interview him, and he says, what was this all about? You know, how did he get these people to, you know, kill Sharon Tate and these, or why were they going to that place in the first place? He says, well, there was this guy who denied him like a recording contract or something like that, and he thought he lived there, and so he sent these people to kill them, and he wanted his underlings to go do it because Manson wanted them to get dirt on their hands so they would be subservient to him. He wanted to have dirt on them so that, you know, they would be under his control even more. Cool. So to me, it seems like, well, that's kind of like a more probable explanation. You know, that seems to happen a lot. Not necessarily in the same circumstances where, you know, all these murders are going to happen, but yeah, people are going to manipulate other people and they hold a grudge against someone, and so they want to get retaliation. To me, that seems like the plausible explanation. The irony for me with Tom O'Neill is that he talks about Bugliosi's book and tears it apart and does a really good job at it, saying the reason why, you know, Helter Skelter, this race war, you know, Bugliosi apparently says that, you know, Manson's wanting to spark this, and O'Neill thinks that Bugliosi did that so he could sell books. This is obviously very sensational. If Manson really did want to do that, then yeah, that's like the biggest story in the world, then this is going to sell tons of books, and it did. It sold a ton of books. For me, the irony is that, you know, O'Neill is making this connection to MKUltra, and to me, it seems like that's kind of sensationalizing it too. I think there's this more probable explanation, and I don't really see the connection. I don't think he's doing it because he's trying to sensationalize it to sell books. I think he's putting that in his book, even though there's not like that clear, direct evidence that there's a link, because he did all this research for 30 years or however long it was, and he kind of falls victim to the fallacy of sunk costs. I did all this research looking up this guy Jolly West because I thought there was a connection, and even though I didn't find a direct one, there still might be something there. So, you know, I don't want this to go into the scrap bin, so I'm going to put it in the book too. Right. So I don't think there was a nefarious intent in it. I think he's doing it because, hey, I did all this research and I want people to know what I was researching. And I like that part of the book, like the research and what he's doing, but I was just not convinced of the connection that he is drawing.
It's been a while since I read that book, and it's been a while since I listened to podcasts with him on it. So some of the details I can't remember right now. To me, a part of it that really made it compelling, though, was, and I can't remember some of the specifics, I wish I could, but maybe some people in the comments can know about, was when he met with Bugliosi a bunch, and then the guy was like threatening him as well. He was a real psychopath and able to uncover that. But when he went through the case and all the things that Bugliosi was almost like, I forget what the psychological term, but you know how when you're like, ooh, look everyone, a big bad thing right here, wow. And you're like, all right, don't let them see that. He was basically doing that by making this Helter Skelter and making this all about blood, guts, and gore, and the guy's just a crazy cult leader murderer, so that, oh yeah, we're not going to talk about the probation officer and stuff like that. Meaning like either he's a part of it or some people have leaned on him and said, hey, Mr. Prosecutor, no one can know about this kind of thing. And that was very compelling to me. It doesn't put necessarily Jolly West in the room with Manson. And again, I got to go back and look at it and see exactly what he said. But it does make it certainly interesting considering all the perfect things that were in place, like Marxist, hippie movement. You know, you have a terrorizing event in Hollywood, by the way, with a model star who's married to like the hottest director at the time before he, you know, did what he did, you know, and all that. And it's like, it is reasonable to say that the day that the 60s ended, figuratively, and the day that the actual full-blown hippie movement ended was when the Tate murders happened. So if you are, and again, this is playing in some probabilities rather than pointing to an exact piece of evidence right now, but based upon the CIA's, at least internal documents talking about the hippie movement and having concerns about that, if you are the CIA and everything you hate exists in communism or anything that could be even slightly traced to it, that's a very good outcome for you if something horrific suddenly takes these peaceful, yay, you know, hippies and makes them this evil cult that you're like, oh, wait, I don't want my kids involved with that. Or even as kids, you're like, I don't want to be involved with that. I'm scared of that. My mom talks about she was like 6 and she had dreams that like Charles Manson was going to come to get her, you know, and like there was a real psychological effect on society here. So I don't know. It does tie together very perfectly like a bow. And I think it's reasonable, again, without having seen the evidence recently, for you to say, well, maybe there's some things where there could be a leap because it's based on, you know, it seems like it could be, and we don't really have anything to prove that happened.
Well, let me play devil's advocate against myself.
Sure.
There are there's one main story of Jolly West in this book that I put where he does seem to interfere in some kind of interrogation. It's a really sad story. It's this guy named Jimmy Shaver at Lackland Air Force Base. He's this air officer, and he kidnaps and abuses this young girl and kills her. And Jolly West is put in charge of trying to get the story out of this guy. Obviously, afterwards, he doesn't want to talk about anything. He says, I had nothing to do with that, whatever. And there's just like blood over his clothes and everything. So West decides he's going to perform some of these interrogation methods that he's been talking about with Sidney Gottlieb in their correspondence. So he drugs him, he does some hypnosis on him, and during the interrogation, the guy opens up a little bit about, well, okay, maybe it is the case that, she got in the car with me and maybe we did go down to this gravel pit, but that's all. Like, I don't know what happened. I blanked out. I can't remember. And then there's a cut in the recording of the interrogation for about 30 minutes or so, and then it picks right up. And then afterwards, when it picks back up, Jolly West says to Jimmy Shaver, okay, so now I want you to tell everyone what we just talked about in that session. And he starts talking about how, okay, maybe I did do this and maybe whatever. And it's like, well, what happened during those 30 minutes?
Those 30 minutes.
West starts asking all these leading questions to him, like, now, isn't it the case that you abused her in this way in particular and all that? And leading questions, and then Shaver kind of goes along with it. So for me, it's like, what's going on in those 30 minutes? It almost seems like to me, it almost seems like he was telling Jimmy Shaver, you're going to get the death penalty if you keep saying what you're saying. Or, you're going to get the death penalty. Your only shot here is to plead insanity. There's a long record of Jolly West being completely against the death penalty.
Really?
Yeah. Completely.
Oh, he's a humanitarian.
Yeah, so he has a lot of written stuff, how it's a terrible thing. It takes away from a person their own autonomy, and that's the one thing you actually should have. So he's against the death penalty, So I think it's possible that during those 30 minutes, he was trying to negotiate with Shaver, basically like, admit to this stuff and we can make you out to look insane. I'm going to ask you some leading questions about how God came to you and all this stuff and told you to do this. And, there's this, you're evil. I think it was like his evil cousin or something when he was young, abused him and made him do this stuff. Or, it affected him in such a way. So that might be some tampering right there that I think Jolly West was fully capable of. Where that gets interesting again is he always sought out sensational legal cases. He really wanted a high profile for himself. He liked being in the spotlight. One of those was Jack Ruby. And so
you took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah. So when Jack Ruby is in jail,
spent a lot of hours with him.
Yeah. So Jack Ruby ends up going insane, and
conveniently.
The judge in the case, this is for the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald. The judge in the case asked that there be a psychiatrist that evaluate Jack Ruby to determine whether he's sane or not. And so one of the psychiatrists who does this is Jolly West.
Yeah, they just sent him.
Yeah.
He was the guy.
Yeah.
There were no other psychiatrists.
Afterwards, the judge says, I want somebody really disinterested to go and do it. And so Jolly West is put to the side, and another psychiatrist goes in, and the other psychiatrist says, yeah, he's insane. There's no way. It doesn't seem to me like this could have been, it seems legitimate, like it wouldn't have been on set randomly or something, unless somebody drugged him or whatever, and nobody had access to him. Well, it's like, well, Jolly West had access to him right before that. So I don't know if that's true, but to play devil's advocate against myself, I think it's possible that West was trying to manipulate these cases in a certain way.
Yeah, how does he, and even at the front end of that, though, I make the joke about it, but in all seriousness, judge orders this. It's the biggest case in the world at that time. How does he end up being the first psychologist who goes in there? Of the probably million psychologists that exist, at least within, a flight's time away.
Yeah.
To get there, he's the guy?
Yeah.
That's awfully coincidental.
Yeah. He is one of the most famous in the country. And this might be a situation of confusing correlation with causation. I don't know. But it could be the case that the reason why he's involved in MKUltra and this trial and Patty Hearst is because he was already really famous from the Korean War stuff. Right. So is it correlation? Like everyone wants him to be involved because he's famous, or do they want him to be involved because there's something going on? So I don't want to confuse correlation and causation, but it's something to think about.
That's the devil's advocate to the devil's advocate of the devil's advocate. That's some next level shit. All right, can we actually pull this up, Alessi? Because I'm glad you brought that up. Jolly West, Jack Ruby. Let's see what CIApedia says about this. Okay, a lot.
Yeah, it like popped up before I even could type it in.
By the way, did you because you did one chapter on this, but did you look into Jolly West's origin story on a similar way that you looked into Gottlieb?
No, not really. I the opposite, in fact. His son wrote a book about West's death because West committed suicide with the help of his son. His son helped him kill himself by downing pills. He had cancer all throughout his body. And, I mentioned that he was against the death penalty, Jolly West was. And so he eventually wanted to take that autonomy into his own hands, and he got his son to help him kill himself. And then a couple years later, his son killed his own mother again in like this, assisted suicide type thing. And then a few years after that, the son killed himself. So there's some weird stuff going on.
Okay.
Not that that's like a conspiracy or something. It's just his son wrote a book about this. So the son wrote a book about how he helped his parents kill himself.
All right, let's start with the Fox 2, and then we're going to come back to the 6th floor museum. So yeah, let's start with that one. So it says psychiatrist what was the title there? Psychiatrist 1960s LSD mind control experiments come back to haunt America. Last month's U.S. National Archives release of thousands of previously classified documents collected as part of U.S. government review in the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 has raised questions about a prominent psychiatrist who assessed Jack Ruby, who murdered Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged killer of Kennedy before Oswald got to trial. The December 15, 2022 release of the documents has resurrected attention to the late Louis Jolly West, a California psychiatrist who was funded by the CIA to conduct LSD experiments in the 50s to 70s. The Citizens Commission on Human Rights International mental health industry watchdog said it also raises concerns about the military psychedelic drug research being conducted today. Okay, go down. Let's go. So, according to West's written assessment, Ruby was, quote, technically insane, unquote, and in need of immediate psychiatric hospitalization. Those are conclusions that puzzlingly, no one who had spoken to Jack Ruby previously had reached. That's funny. Ruby had seemed perfectly sane to the people who knew him. Louis West pronounced him crazy, according to a recent news report, but West was a prominent player in the now infamous MKUltra program in which CIA doctors gave powerful psychiatric drugs to Americans without their knowledge. Again, you're getting more 3D with what's evidence and what's speculation, and it's really speculation because this is the craziest murder in modern history or whatever you want to say. But
West always denied his affiliation with the CIA. He said there was never anything, and yet we have these letters between him and Sidney Gottlieb's pseudonym, Sherman Grifford. So it's like, of course he did. Yeah,